December 13th of 1972, flight number 571 went down in the Andes. Here to talk about that and so much more about it, I'm really excited about this episode. I have the author of this incredible book with me today. His name is John Guiver. Thank you so much for joining me, John. I am excited to have this conversation with you.
Amanda, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on your podcast, and hopefully we can have a very interesting discussion about this, very iconic story.
It really is. And we were talking a little bit before we jumped into the recording about how this isn't covered in things like air crash investigations, but there's so much to this story. I mean, your book, how many pages is this book?
Well, it's 571 pages.
But there are a lot of really cool photos and stuff in the book that I think a lot of people would probably really enjoy seeing.
It's about 200,000 words, but there are a lot of photos in it.
Yeah. And you cover things like the survivors, about the people who didn't survive, about their families, about the pilots, about what happened, and about the aftermath after the crash, because a lot of people don't realize that there was a period of over 70 days where these people had to survive on their own in the Andes. And what they had to do was just, heartbreaking. Your book is just incredible. So let's talk a little bit about what made you want to write this book. What intrigued you about the story?
Well, I mean, perhaps I should just give a very brief summary of the story to sort of, in case some of your listeners not too familiar with it. So it's a plane crash that happened in the Andes in 1972. It was a rugby team, very close-knit one. They all knew each other. They'd all gone to the same school. And the plane lost its way in the Andes, hit a ridge, and the wings came off, the tail came off. It tobogganed down the other side of the ridge and ended up in this remote valley high up in the Andes. And as you said, no one heard from them again for another 72 days. And the story is incredible in so many ways, which we'll get into. So to answer your question, I had always been interested in the story since there was a book called Alive by an English author, Piers Paul Reed, that was the authorized account, the official account. And it was written in 1974. A fantastic book. And it really, you got to know, the situation, you got to know the survivors and so on. I was fascinated. I was a little bit, one of the things that bugged me about the book was that the people who didn't survive, who were very important to the whole survival process, because many of them survived for quite some time on the mountain, but also because of what they had to do. We didn't really know about them, so I wanted to find out about these non-survivors. And in 2013, I made a trip to the mountain where this crash occurred, where they stayed for 72 days. I was with a small expedition of, I think we were about 15 people. And, it was an incredible experience. But I got to know one of the survivors, a guy called Eduardo Strauch. And through him, I got to know another survivor, a guy called Pedro Algorta. Pedro, I'd always wanted to meet, actually, because he was perhaps the most aloof of all the survivors. And so from an outsider's point of view, perhaps, someone you could identify with more. What I did was I offered to translate his memoir, which had just come out, despite not speaking a word of Spanish. But I actually carried through with that, and I translated his memoir. We became good friends, and through him, I gradually became embedded in the community. So I started to meet a lot of people, the other survivors. I'm good friends with many of them. But for me, it was more important the families of those who didn't come back, and these were the brothers and sisters. And so I started to get more and more involved. I also that's one side of it. The other side was I contacted Piers Paul Reed, who wrote the original Alive, And he was very kind. He opened up his archive and gave me privileged access to his archive, which includes interviews with with the survivors from the time, from 1973, a couple of months after they'd returned. And so I gradually sort of built up this huge body of knowledge, and also had, very immediate contact with many of the protagonists in the story. And I felt it was important to write, a comprehensive history of the event, from a perspective really of 50 years. So.
Yeah. It's hard to wrap my brain around the fact that that was 50 years ago. I'm older than I look.
You
And
look very
yet
young.
yet it really was that long ago, and they still have families that are still alive, and in some cases absolutely thriving, in
Yeah,
spite of having gone through such a horrific tragedy of losing family members, or having a family member go through everything that they had to go through.
right.
Let's talk a little bit about what these guys had to go through after the accident. So the plane went
Yeah.
down, they tobogganed over the bridge. They're in this remote valley. Nobody's going to find them, and they think that this is going to be the end for them.
Well, no, actually, they're in the immediate aftermath of the accident. There's still 33 out of the 45 people on the plane. There were 40 passengers and 5 crew members. There's still 33 that are alive. A few of them die, so they have to shelter in this broken fuselage. So it's sort of open at the back where the tails come off, and it's sort of broken in various places. They try and get the seats out and make a bit of room, and there are several, who are fairly badly injured, and they all try to cram in because it's desperately cold. There's a snowstorm, there's an icy wind, and people are in pain, people are crying out. So surviving, I mean, that first night was absolute hell, and 5 or 6 of those survivors die on that first night. And so there are really, you can say there are 28 people who genuinely survived the accident, and they have to start, they believe they're going to be rescued, very soon. I mean, you would, right? You're
Right.
in a
You would
plane
hope.
crash, it's gone down, you survived. The pilots were in contact with the control tower, and they assume they're going to be, rescued. They soon find out that water is a big issue because, there's only snow and ice, and you can't really hydrate with that. So they figured out ways to melt the water. Of course, there were a couple of medical students, first, second year medics,
Right.
who sort of took care of the injured, and there were a few broken legs. There were some, bad cuts and hemorrhaging and stuff like that, but they did a pretty amazing job.
Yeah, they really
And
stepped
then,
up. I
yeah, they
loved
did.
that part of their story. They just, they went to
Incredible.
action. They knew that this was what they needed. So we're going to do this.
Yeah, and the captain of the team, he was a guy called Marcelo Perez. He was organizing everyone who's getting people, well, you group of people, you need to get the seats out of the fuselage, you guys need to make water, you need to sort of, take the dead bodies out, and the doctors, and then and so on. So it was all, and the fact that they were all very closely knew each other, I think helped there. But there were definitely some leaders who stepped up immediately and very, very proactively. And then on the Sunday, so they crashed on a Friday, sort of late afternoon. On the Sunday, they saw planes go over, search planes. They thought, well, great, they've seen us, that we're going to be rescued in a day or two, it'd be fantastic. And the days go by, and and nothing happens. And the realists among them, say, well, we're, they've given up on us. The planes searched over our area. We've heard them searching further away. They're definitely not coming. And so they had to make the very difficult decision. How are we going to survive? Because they tried some expeditions. They couldn't get, more than a few hundred feet from the fuselage. The snow was deep. It was too cold to stay out overnight. So they had to make the decision to use the bodies of their, of their friends. And these really were their friends. I mean,
Right.
these were people they'd gone to, primary and middle school with.
They were basically
Um,
family.
yeah, and really how they sort of rationalized it in many ways, but the real thing that helped them break the taboo was they said, well, look, if I die, I'm happy for my body to be used. And
Right.
by extrapolation, because we know these guys so well, we think that they would say the same thing. And so that provided sort of one of the big rationalizations. So so that that they sort of gradually started, and then they heard on little radio, after they'd made this decision, really, that they got the official confirmation. They heard a station in Uruguay, which is where the guys were from. They were from Uruguay, which is in the eastern part of South America, and they were flying to Chile, which is in the west part of South America. And so they're flying over the Andes. They heard that the search had been called off and they weren't going to resume it for another till February, and it was October. So
That had to be
they said,
terrifying.
well, but what it did was they went from this situation where they were waiting, and it was sort of they were waiting for someone to rescue them, to one where, well, we're going to have to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they decided on the food thing. They started building up some of the rugby players to help to get strong. They got extra food to trek out of there, and then the whole plan was thrown out of the window when an avalanche hit, right? After well, it was about 2 weeks in.
As if they didn't already have enough problems.
If you can imagine this, so it killed 8 more of them, their
Ugh.
friends, and if you can imagine, they're already stuck in this remote valley, but now they're in a plane that's half full of snow, and the surface of the plane is covered as well. So they're sort of buried in the snow, in the plane, underneath the snow in a remote valley. You can't really get any more isolated than that.
Yeah. And even if they did pick up the rescue searches again, there's no way they would have seen this.
Right.
There's no way.
And so so it took them 3 days to get out of that. And then the rest of their story is really about various expeditions they made, and until they, many of them abortive, until the point they made the final expedition. 2 of them, well, 3 of them set out, 1 returned. Yeah. And 2 of them did a 10-day trek through the Andes and were spotted by a shepherd high up in the Chilean foothills.
Wow.
And that was the first anyone outside had heard from them, for 70 days.
Was there any animosity among the families when they found out what had happened to their loved ones who had passed on?
Well, extraordinarily, I mean, so of course there was a lot of, after 2 or 3 days it emerged what they'd done, and there was a lot of sensationalist headlines in the press, particularly in Chile and Argentina and the rest of South America, not so much in Uruguay. But they decided really not to speak too much to the press until they got back to Uruguay, when they held a press conference, and they dealt with the issue there in a very, very respectful way. And the families of those who died were actually very supportive. Actually, I just want to read out some of the things that some of the families said. So one of the fathers of one of the boys who died, he said, "Thank God that 45 were there so that 16 homes were able to regain their children." I mean, incredible, wow. Right? So another said, one of the mothers said, "We support the decision taken by the boys, and we're trying to help them overcome this ordeal." So their viewpoint was, these 16 survivors, they're going to be under huge psychological, pressure because of, the world looking in at what they've done. But we're going to support them in this ordeal because we can help them better than anyone, because we're the parents of their friends. So it's there were some incredible reactions, and there were others. I mean, there were some families who felt who distanced themselves from it and felt that it shouldn't have happened, but they were the exception rather than the norm.
And it's amazing that they were so willing to embrace them. Hey, you survived. That's,
Yeah.
congratulations. I'll miss my family member forever, but you survived. You got through this. Yeah, that
And you can imagine,
encouragement. That's cool.
Amanda, so to give you a sense of how close this community was. So this was a small community in Montevideo, but a privileged community. It was a professional community. In 1960, so this was 12 years before the accident, 26 out of the 40 passengers were at the same middle or junior school.
Wow.
So the rugby team that came out of them were old boys of that school, and they'd actually won the Uruguayan championship. All rugby was amateur in those days, and in fact, till quite recently. So they were a very good rugby team. They were the best in Uruguay at the time. But you imagine these come from this neighborhood of maybe, a couple of thousand people, or a few thousand people. Everyone knew each other. Survivors and people who died had girlfriends in the community, and they were cousins and neighbors and so on. Everyone had a very strong connection to almost everyone on the flight. So now you get the situation where you get a survivor coming back, and they're living next door to someone, a friend of theirs who's not only died in the Andes, but they had to use his body to survive. So you can imagine this immense. People didn't really want to talk about it in the community for many, many years, because the survivors didn't want to, bring up the
You don't want
subject.
to relive something like that.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to go through it, but yeah, after you go through it, people want to know details, and people are nosy. They want all the gory, dirty details. They don't want to know the good stuff. It's the bad news that travels the fastest.
Well, I think that's true. Although within that community, everyone was everyone was very respectful. The families didn't want to know any details about what happened on the mountain.
Yeah.
They didn't. They said, look, this is something the survivors did. That's their business. It's none of our business. That's private to them. And I think to a large extent that's the way it should be.
Yeah, I think that was a really very mature way to handle it.
Yeah.
I don't know if we would have that kind of maturity here in a large city in Colorado. I think we would struggle if something like this were to happen. You would have half the people congratulating the survivors and the other half up in arms and wishing that they were, among the deceased.
Well, I think maybe the closest thing is perhaps one of these small communities that have had school shootings. There's where a lot of people who know each other have, some. My book's called To Play the Game, so some have won and some have lost.
Right.
In that game, and it's just a matter of chance where a particular child was. When the shooter came.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good sort of good analogy to understand. The grief and the and the healing and so on within a small community.
To the best of your knowledge, what was it that really helped them to kind of come out of that, we don't want to talk about this, to where they were willing to talk to you so that you could get more information to actually tell the story of the deceased and the survivors?
Well, for the survivors, you see, with the survivors, although I know the survivors, some of them very well, I didn't want to interview them for this book because they've talked about it so much that they can't, it's difficult for them to remember exactly, what was said in the umpteen interviews they've done and not. So I really wanted to go back to the original, interviews from 1973, and look at their statements there. to tell their story. For the families, they'd really, most of them had never spoken about it outside the community. And I started getting, through my contacts, getting very, friendly with a few of those families and chatting with them. And the fact that I knew so much about the story and that I wasn't a journalist, I wasn't, mercenary in any, I wasn't looking for a sensational story.
Right. You
They
were a
started,
developer in artificial intelligence before this.
right. I was, yes. They I mean, we got a good rapport, and they warmed to me, and I certainly warmed to them. The wonderful people, unanimously. I mean, every family I met was fantastic. But word of mouth spread that I was doing, this project to try and sort of raise the profile of those who died, because for the point of view is history. If I look back, in some of these historical events like Shackleton's open boat, voyage and stuff like that, you have these people who are involved and you know so little about them, but they were so important to that whole episode. And I really felt for the history, well, the brothers and sisters were still, were at a good point to speak about it. Most of them a similar age to me. They're sort of, many of them retired. And so there was an opportunity to speak to them, and sort of word of mouth spread that I was doing this project to elevate those who didn't survive. And I did a chapter on each one, and I sort of sent them off individually to the different families, so they could see that this was actually becoming a reality. And in doing that, I actually got much more engagement. And so then I had to rewrite all the chapters again. And so I think they came out very well. But of course, you can't tell those stories in isolation. So I wanted to really tell the story in a quite detailed context. So I talk about the history of Uruguay, the history of the sort of the neighborhoods they came from, a bit about the politics of the time, and so on. So I wanted to really include all of that so people could really understand the context this group of people came from, this very special community that these people came from, to really sort of humanize it in some ways. Because, so I say in my preface, you mention the story and people say, oh, that's the one about the rugby players, or often people say the football players who ate each other. And it's sort of a bit, grimy and sort of
that's disrespectful.
And in fact, they came from this very vibrant community. Were very, well educated or bilingual. Most of them speak good English. So they went from this fantastic community they lived in to suddenly this remote, horrific environment, completely separated from the world. So it's an extraordinary story.
It really is. I love that you've been able to bring it to life. You have done so much to bring honor and dignity to the names of every person involved, not just those who survived. And your book it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you very much.
I am really happy that I have a copy of it, because I have several friends that I've been telling, hey, you're getting a copy of this for Christmas. You're not getting my copy, but you're getting a copy for Christmas, because you got to read this story. It's amazing.
Yeah, good. Well, I mean, I think it's a book that has lots in it. Not everyone will want to read the whole thing. Some of us want to dip into it. People who know the story well, I think, they really engage with it. People who, just want to get a flavor of it, maybe they'll read, some bits of it, dip into some bits of it. For people who are interested in air crash investigation, I have several chapters on, the cause of the crash.
Right.
which I think is quite interesting. It's very, very technical, but it's sort of an air crash investigation. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you went from, like I said, a creator and developer for artificial intelligence to diving into that technical world and diving into the humanity of it. And I just think that is so fascinating. You found your passion and you followed it.
Well, yeah, it was always a passion. It just came at the right time. I just sort of, I probably would have retired a couple of 2 or 3 years after I actually did. So it sort of precipitated my retirement because I just didn't have the time. I wanted it to be out for the, for the anniversary of the event.
Yeah.
So it sort of it hastened my retirement, but it came at the right time. Yeah, I mean, it was a great retirement project.
And this memorial image that's on the cover of your book,
Yes,
when you went there, did you take this
I
yourself?
went there. This was taken in December. I can't remember what year. I think it's around 2010 or 12. I think more like 2012 or 13.
Yeah.
And it was taken by a mountaineer who's one of a group of 5 people who followed at the same time of year the footsteps of the 2 who trekked out. So you see at the very back of that picture, you see that sort of head wall right at the back,
right,
in the middle. That's actually 3,000 feet high. That wall
goodness
there.
gracious.
And that's what they climbed. It took them 3 days to get to the top of that. So these distances are really, really, misleading. And the tomb you see there, yeah, I've been there twice. So when I went there wasn't snow around the tomb, but there was on the glacier. I went in January 2013 and 2015. That's where the remains are buried, up there, and there's a big there's a pilgrimage there every year in the summer that many Argentinians, Uruguayans, and people from all around the world go up there to pay their respects, really.
If you've enjoyed tonight's episode, please make sure you check out the episode description. You'll find links there on how you can learn more about this guest, links to connect with them on social media, and how to support the podcast. Remember, I don't get paid to do this. My boss is a bit tight-fisted, but I can say that. I work for myself.